High above the Tibetan Plateau, a vast expanse of rugged beauty and ancient mystery, Sichuan Airlines Flight 863. Three sliced through the early morning sky, its wings cutting through the crisp air with precision. It was a routine flight, one of countless others that had traversed this route without incident. The Airbus A319, with 119 souls aboard, hummed gently, carrying its passengers towards their destination. The aircraft was a marvel of modern engineering, designed to withstand the rigors of high-altitude flight. Captain Liu Chuanjian, a veteran pilot with over 10,000 flight hours, calmly monitored the controls. His experience and steady hand had guided many flights safely to their destinations. His co-pilot, First Officer Xu Shu, relaxed in his seat, confident in the routine nature of their journey. The two had flown together many times, forming a bond of trust and mutual respect. In the cabin, passengers slept, read, or gazed out the windows at the breathtaking vista below. The snow-capped peaks and deep valleys of the Tibetan Plateau stretched out as far as the eye could see, a testament to the raw power of nature. It was a scene of peaceful normalcy, a stark contrast to the terror that was about to unfold, the calm before the storm, as it were. At 7:07 a.m., a sharp, explosive bang shattered the tranquility. The sound was so sudden and violent that it seemed to come from the very heart of the aircraft. A deafening roar filled the cockpit, as if a giant hand had struck the aircraft. The noise was overwhelming, drowning out all other sounds and filling the crew with a sense of impending doom. The cockpit windshield, without warning, cracked. The thick, reinforced glass, designed to withstand extreme pressures, had given way in an instant. The sudden decompression sucked papers, food, and loose objects into the sky. The cabin, once a place of order and calm, was now a chaotic whirlwind. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling, dangling like startled ghosts. The passengers, jolted from their peaceful activities, scrambled to put them on. The temperature plummeted to a frigid -40 degrees Celsius. The once warm and comfortable cabin was now an icy tomb. The plane lurched violently, tossed around like a toy in a hurricane. Chaos erupted as passengers screamed and clung to their seats, their faces masks of fear. The force of the decompression ripped the co-pilot's seatbelt apart. The powerful suction was relentless, pulling at everything not securely fastened. Half of First Officer Xu's body was sucked out of the shattered cockpit window. His legs flailed wildly as he struggled to hold on, the wind tearing at his uniform. He clung desperately to the controls, his face contorted in terror as the icy wind tore at him. The force of the wind was like a physical blow, making it nearly impossible to think or move. The roar of the wind was so loud that Captain Liu could barely hear himself think. The noise was a constant, unrelenting assault on his senses. He fought to control the aircraft, his heart pounding against his ribs. Every muscle in his body was tense, his mind racing through possible solutions. The plane, now a wounded bird, bucked and trembled, threatening to spiral down to the unforgiving mountains below. The jagged peaks loomed ominously, a deadly reminder of the stakes at hand. Captain Liu knew that every second counted, and he was determined to bring his aircraft and its passengers safely back to the ground. The terrifying force of the wind tore through the cockpit, whipping Captain Liu's face. The gusts were so strong that they felt like invisible hands trying to rip him from his seat. Papers and debris swirled around him, obscuring his vision. The cockpit, usually a place of order and control, had turned into a chaotic whirlwind. His mind raced, desperately trying to process the situation. Every second counted, and he knew that any hesitation could be fatal. He knew they were in a life-or-death struggle, a desperate battle against the elements and the unforgiving laws of physics. The plane shuddered violently, each jolt a reminder of the thin line between survival and disaster. The instruments spun wildly, their needles dancing erratically. Altitude, speed, and direction were all a blur, making it impossible to rely on them for guidance. He couldn't rely on them. The instruments were useless in this storm, and he had to trust his instincts more than ever. He had to rely on his instincts, on his years of experience. Every maneuver, every decision was a test of his skills and his resolve. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" Captain Liu cried into the radio, his voice tight with urgency. The static-filled response from air traffic control was barely audible, but he clung to it like a lifeline. He fought against the wind's relentless assault, his hands straining against the controls. The muscles in his arms burned with the effort, but he couldn't afford to let go. He knew that if he lost control even for a second, the plane would plummet to the earth. The stakes were unimaginably high, and the margin for error was non-existent. He had to get them down, but the nearest airport was still hundreds of miles away. The thought of navigating through this storm for that long was daunting, but he had no choice. Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, panic ensued. The once calm and orderly space had descended into chaos. Oxygen masks dangled uselessly, many ripped away by the force of the decompression. The sight of the masks, meant to be a lifeline, now added to the sense of helplessness. Passengers screamed, their eyes wide with terror. The fear was palpable, a living, breathing entity that filled the cabin. Some prayed, clutching rosaries or prayer beads. Their whispered prayers were a desperate plea for salvation in the face of overwhelming odds. Others frantically sent text messages to loved ones, their words a jumbled mix of love and fear. Each message was a potential final goodbye, a last connection to the world they might soon leave behind. The plane pitched and rolled, buffeted by the wind. It felt like a small boat in a stormy sea, tossed about by forces far beyond its control. It felt like the end was near. The relentless turbulence made it seem as though the plane could break apart at any moment. Adding to the terror, the plane suddenly dropped several thousand feet. The rapid descent was like a roller coaster plunge, but with no promise of safety at the end. The force of the descent slammed passengers against the ceiling, their cries of fear swallowed by the roar of the wind. The cabin was a scene of utter pandemonium. It was a terrifying freefall, a sickening plunge towards the jagged peaks of the Himalayas that loomed ever closer. The mountains, beautiful from a distance, now seemed like the teeth of a monstrous beast ready to devour them. The world outside the windows became a blur of white and brown, a dizzying kaleidoscope of snow-capped peaks and rocky valleys. The landscape, usually a source of wonder, was now a harbinger of doom. Back in the cockpit, Captain Liu fought to regain control. His muscles screamed in protest, but he dared not relax his grip on the controls. He had to stabilize the plane, had to buy them some time. He risked a glance at his co-pilot's seat. It was empty. First Officer Xu was gone, ripped from the cockpit by the wind. The sheer force of the wind at 32,000 feet had sucked the co-pilot out of the aircraft. He vanished into the blinding whiteness below, swallowed by the clouds. Captain Liu, his heart heavy with grief and fear, knew that Xu had no chance of survival. He shoved down his emotions, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. He had to bring the plane down safely. He was all that stood between the passengers and certain death. The loss of his co-pilot was a devastating blow, but Captain Liu couldn't afford to dwell on it. He was alone, battling against the elements, against time, against the odds. His mind raced, calculating, strategizing. He had to find a way out of this, had to somehow land this wounded bird. Down in the passenger cabin, a young boy, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe, pointed towards the window. His small hand trembled as he tried to make sense of the surreal scene unfolding outside. He tugged at his mother's sleeve, his voice barely audible above the wind's roar. The airplane shuddered and the boy's grip tightened, his knuckles turning white. "Mama, look! Angels!" he cried, his finger tracing shapes in the swirling clouds outside. The clouds seemed to dance and morph, creating figures that only a child's imagination could conjure. His mother, her own face pale with fear, tried to comfort him. She glanced out the window, her heart racing, but saw nothing but the turbulent sky. "There are no angels, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling. She wanted to believe her own words, but the uncertainty in her tone betrayed her. "It's just the wind, the clouds," she added, trying to sound more convincing. The plane lurched again, and she held her breath, praying silently for the turbulence to end. But the boy was insistent. His eyes, filled with a strange mix of fear and wonder, remained fixed on the window. He pointed again, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. "No, Mama, look, they're trying to help us!" he exclaimed, his voice rising with excitement and conviction. His mother looked again, squinting into the clouds, but saw nothing. She sighed, pulling him close, hoping to calm his racing heart. Across the aisle, an elderly woman clutched a small worn book in her hands, her lips moving silently in prayer. Her fingers traced the familiar pages, seeking solace in the words she had read countless times. She had been a devout Buddhist all her life, but never had her faith been tested like this. The turbulence shook her resolve, but she held on to her beliefs with unwavering determination. She prayed for the safety of everyone on board, for the souls of those who had already perished, and for the strength of the pilot who held their lives in his hands. Her prayers were a lifeline, a thread of hope in the chaos. As the plane continued to be buffeted by the wind, some passengers claimed to hear strange whispers carried on the wind, faint, ethereal voices murmuring in a language they couldn't understand. The whispers seemed to weave through the cabin, touching each passenger with a sense of unease. Were they hallucinations brought on by fear and oxygen deprivation? The passengers exchanged worried glances, their minds racing with possibilities. Or was there something more to it, something beyond human comprehension? The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if trying to convey a message from another realm. The passengers, caught between fear and curiosity, could only wonder what awaited them beyond the clouds.